Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome back to the Awaken and Align podcast. I'm your host, Laura Chung. I am going to talk about the symbolism behind the film Sinners. So, if you have not watched the film yet, you might want to go do that first because this will all make more sense. But if not, you can stick around for the natal chart reading of Ryan Coogler, who is the director of the film, and the most significant transits that he was going through in forming, in downloading, in creating this film. I sourced different dates from his various interviews that he's done on podcasts, on TV shows, but also just doing press for the movie. So all of these dates that I'm about to show have been documented by those interviews, which is great for an astrologer because then you can really track the transits. So if you are new here, welcome. I am a Western tropical astrologer. I use the whole sign house system. And the reason why I was interested in doing this is because I watched Sinners 2 weekends ago, opening weekend, and maybe it's my Mercury in Pisces, maybe it's my sun in the fifth house, but that's just how I watch movies and listen to music. I am able to connect the dots of who the creator of this artwork is. So the director, the actors involved, the specific time period that they were creating this, and then when it's released, the moment in time, the moment in history when the audience is ready to see it and interpret its meaning. So I was interested in this because I felt like it was such a beautiful piece of art to bring in different genres. This movie talks about spirituality, both in the hoodoo. There's a hoodoo healer in the movie, and also the Christian church, the Black Christian church, and music and blues music, and the origins of music, which rock music, grunge music, and jazz are all rooted in Black music, essentially from America. And the themes of colonialism and capitalism are all embedded in this movie. And I just thought, wow, what a beautiful piece of art to reflect the times. And so I just wanted to look at what transits was Ryan Coogler going through, because he said that he went to visit a cotton field and he gave a specific date in his interview with the Breakfast Club. It was November 17th, 2021. And he was standing in a cotton field. It was the first time he had seen one. And then during that time, he was going through filming Black Panther 2, Wakanda Forever, and having to grapple with the death of Chadwick Boseman, the actor who played Black Panther, and the death of Nipsey Hussle. And there was another artist he spoke about, Young Dolph, I believe his name was, and his uncle. And his uncle was the one that really reminded him of blues music. And he was going through a lot of death, and he was asking his friends, what do you do to get through really dark times and depression? And a lot of people said music. So that ultimately, he went on this journey to discovering the roots of grunge music, which has its roots in blues music. And so he was in this interview with the Breakfast Club, Charlemagne the God, and the co-host. He was explaining how he thought that a movie can come from this. And I watched another interview of somebody asking him how long it took him to write the script. And he said 2 months. And if you know anything about writing anything, there is some sort of spiritual download you get. You can call it source, you can call it the creative flow, being in the flow, but you get into the zone and something else takes over and you just start writing. I mean, that's how I experience it. So I wanted to see the transits that he was going through, that enabled him to channel in this way. And I think I'm in my own healing journey, my own spiritual journey, where I don't necessarily resonate with being in a victim or survivor state anymore, but more of co-creation. Like, and also within my activism work, I don't want to continue to focus on the trauma and focus on what happened to me. I want to co-create something, art and something that is for the collective. And I think it's due to my sun in the fifth house. The fifth house in astrology is all about co-creation. I mean, it also is entertainment, right? So you'll see that Ryan Coogler and Michael B. Jordan both have fifth house placements as well. So it was all very interesting listening to the interviews that he was doing, looking at the astrology transits and his own natal chart, and kind of mapping out what he was going through. So, just as a little like background, this movie was released on April 18th, which was the weekend of Good Friday and Easter. So, already there's this like spiritual symbolism of Good Friday being the execution, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ on the cross, and Easter is when he resurrected from the dead. And because Ryan Coogler went through and was grappling with the death of, like I mentioned before, Nipsey Hussle, Young Dolph, his uncle, and Chadwick Boseman, there were a lot of themes of death and rebirth and what the afterlife means for us humans. However, this wasn't intentional, or it what maybe is intentional, but it was planned to be released in March, but the LA fires delayed the release. And I think that timing actually works better for Ryan Coogler and this film because, as you know, March was full of retrogrades and eclipses. So I think delaying the release, it just goes better with the astrology anyway. And then they were editing the movie in February, which was the Mars retrograde. And I think since Mars was going through Cancer and Leo, it also makes sense with his chart. And I found all of this out through a New Yorker article. What's interesting about the release is the transits were also really interesting. So on April 17th, Mercury and Neptune were conjunct at 0 degrees of Aries. And I do believe that's significant because Mercury is the planet of communication and announcements and starting something new. And Neptune is the planet that represents film, the film industry. And 0 degrees of Aries is pioneering something, starting something new. And 0 degrees in a cardinal sign is a world point. So this was like the world, I believe it was the worldwide release of Sinners. And then April 18th was the actual date of the movie. Mars re-entered Leo, and Leo is the sign of actors and filmmaking and creative expression. And Mars is Ryan Coogler's chart ruler. He has a Scorpio rising. So Mars is a very important planet for him. On April 19th, so the day after the film was released, so this was the weekend that I watched it, Mars and Leo was trine to Neptune and Aries at 0 degrees. So again, like Mars re-entering Leo from the retrograde, trining to Neptune and Aries at 0 degrees. It's a world point. It's very harmonious. It's very supportive. So the film got really great reviews. I think it got like 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it was wildly widely received. It was a lot of people love the movie. I haven't heard anybody say anything negative about the movie yet. Or yeah, at least not people that I know who have seen the film. So, and I think Neptune also is impactful in this conversation because they filmed this movie while Neptune was still in the sign of Pisces, which is all about spirituality and music. But it was released in Neptune and Aries, which is, again, about pioneering something. And what's significant about this being released in Neptune and Aries, and that Mercury and Neptune conjunction at 0 degrees of Aries, was it was revealed that Ryan Coogler he received a landmark deal by Warner Brothers by being able to, first of all, get a $90 million budget for this movie, which is well deserved. And he gets money from dollar sales of the film before the studio recuperates the $90 million that they spent. So usually when a director makes a film, they don't get a cut of the film until the studio, let's say a studio spends like $100 million in a movie, they have to recuperate the cost of the film. Then the director and everybody involved gets a cut. But in this case, Ryan Coogler gets a percentage of the film gross ticket sales even before the studio gets to recuperate its cost, which is amazing. And also, he gets the rights to the movie after 25 years, which I didn't know like this was a thing in, I guess, the film industry, but I think it just, again, speaks volumes to the topics and themes of this movie being reflected in real life. And Mercury also signifies contracts. So another thing is that the director got as a director final cut of the movie. And there were other things that were significant in this deal, but I think that was an interesting manifestation of the Mercury and Neptune at 0 degrees and how all of this was revealed. And it's not the first time a director has received this kind of deal, but it's the first time a Black director has received this kind of deal and this much attention towards a movie about, essentially, it's categorized as a horror film because it has vampires, but the real horror that is explained in the movie is white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism. And we're going to talk more about that later on. So I personally believe, because everybody can have their own interpretation of the symbolism behind the movie based on your own lived experience, based on where you're coming from and how much decolonial work you've done, how much anti-racism work you've done, right? But I've listened to enough interviews with Ryan Coogler and Michael B. Jordan at this point that my interpretations of the symbols have been confirmed. So yes, I do believe that the core themes of this movie, there were a lot of spiritual symbolism. And Ryan Coogler himself says that he was raised in the Catholic Church. And so a lot of those symbolisms came out in the movie, like this duality of good and evil. The snake at the beginning, when Smoke and Stack go to retrieve the truck with the alcohol in it and they see a snake, that symbol is a part of the Adam and Eve story when Eve is tempted with the apple. I mean, I think that story specifically in the Bible reconfirms patriarchal tropes, but there's a lot of themes in this movie about temptation and, the 7 deadly sins and how much of your soul do you give to the devil in order for you to get a piece of the privilege and the power that is offered by white supremacy and whiteness as a concept. And I do think it's interesting because Ryan Coogler is a Gemini, and a lot of because Gemini is the archetype of the twins, right? Castor and Pollux. And there's a lot of twin symbolism in this movie. Like in the Bible, you learn about Cain and Abel, and Michael B. Jordan plays twins, Smoke and Stack. And then there's this duality of good and bad, good and evil throughout the movie. So in an interview, Ryan Coogler says that he was inspired to write a story about twins because his aunties are twins. And that is, there's also twins as a Yoruba deity. And he was inspired to write about twins. But it's so interesting because I think that duality of good and evil, and I feel like it just makes sense in the form of twins played by one actor, Michael B. Jordan, when you're watching this movie. And I don't know if anybody else could have played those twins quite like Michael B. Jordan. And Ryan Coogler says he wrote that role specifically for him. And we're going to look at their charts together because they have such beautiful synastry. Um, so then there's other spiritual symbolism around vampire lore. So I love vampire stories. I was a Twilight girly, Vampires Diary girly, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, all the like Interview with the Vampire. Like I just love vampire lore. I don't know why. And in vampire lore, you know that they need an invitation to come in. And so there's also a scene in the movie, there's multiple scenes in the movie where you see that they want to enter the space of, you know, the juke joint. They want to be a part of the party. And there's this whole question of free will and choice, safe spaces, and letting energies in. And I think that is also an allegory to assimilation into the United States and how the main vampire, Remick, who is played by Jack O'Connell. So Irish immigrants, when they came to this country, the United States of America, they were not considered white. They were Italians and Irish people were not considered white until this period of time, like 1932, Jim Crow South. And so when you align yourself to whiteness, which is again a concept, and you assimilate into whiteness, you lose a part of your culture. You lose a part of your ancestral roots, which is what Remick, the vampire, wants so desperately to feel again. That's why he's trying to reconnect with his ancestors through his music, through the Irish jig. And that is why he is obsessed and conjured up to Sammy, because Sammy has he's a blues music prodigy, and he still has his ancestral roots intact. And actually, the voiceover in the beginning of the movie says, I think it's Annie's voice that comes through. She speaks about the Choctaw Indians and the Irish immigrants and the Black people of the African diaspora using music as a way to transcend time and conjure up ancestors. And so, again, with music being a theme of connection and being able to transcend time and healing, and it's spiritual when you listen to music. It's so Neptune and Pisces. So I just thought that was beautiful. So then, yeah, there's vampire lore, the music. It's all also a symbolism of the Black music industry and how it's co-opted, it's appropriated, and it's stripped of all its meaning. I mean, I hate to say it, but I'm going to say it. K-pop artists do the same thing. They appropriate Black culture. They wear all of the Black styles of, you know, streetwear, and then they don't pay homage to Black culture. And that really bugs me because like Jennie from Blackpink is doing that with her new album. And I just think it's, again, just wanting a piece of the culture that's not yours and not giving it appropriate reverence and respect, that those are the roots of the culture. So I thought that was interesting how then Remick and the vampires wanted to get into the juke joint so badly because, you know, they're all partying, they're all together in a community and they're all dancing. And for just one night, they can forget about the fact that they're being hunted down by the KKK, you know, white supremacy in hooded form. They can forget about working the cotton fields. Because again, this is sharecropping time. So this is post-Emancipation Proclamation in the United States, but there's obviously still like, it's Jim Crow South. It's 1932. And this takes place in Clarksdale, Mississippi, I believe. Clarkstown, Mississippi. I think I got that right. And I love the visual. I love all the animal symbolism too, like the visuals of the vultures, the turkey vultures, which symbolize death, but they're also symbolizing culture vultures in the music industry. So that is like the themes and the notes that I took on the film Sinners. And again, if you haven't watched this film and you're listening to this now, I highly recommend you watch it in IMAX. And also Ryan Coogler, there's a clip out there, video clip out there of him explaining the significance of the different films that he shot on, and it was intended for IMAX. So I highly recommend you watch it in IMAX theaters. Again, another nod to Neptune moving from Pisces to Aries, him sharing his filmmaking style too. So I guess we can move on to Ryan Coogler because there's just so much to say about him and his natal chart. So I'm going to share my screen. So if you are listening to this in podcast form, I also have a YouTube channel where you can see his chart on your screen, but I'll try to remember to explain everything that I'm showing you in verbal form. So if this is his correct time, which this gets an AA rating on astro.com, Ryan Coogler was born on May 23rd, 1986 at 5:43 p.m. in Oakland, California. So he is a Gemini sun, closely conjunct his Mercury in Gemini in its domicile. He is a Sag moon and a Scorpio rising. And so he was born on a full moon. And people with their moon and sun in the Gemini Sagittarius axes are storytellers. They are people that were born to tell stories and imagine and share their wisdom and what they've learned. And it's interesting because I watched a TikTok video of someone who watched a video of Ryan Coogler talking about how when he was a young kid, his teacher asked the class to write an essay about what they wanted to do when they grow up. And Ryan Coogler says that he like wrote this essay about how he wanted to be a doctor because he wants to help people. And the teacher said, Ryan, like, you don't have to be a doctor just to help people. You are a storyteller. You are meant to write things and share things because when I read your writing, it's like everything came to life. And so I really do believe that is a manifestation of a Sun Mercury conjunction and opposing his Sagittarius stellium. So he has this moon closely conjunct his Saturn in Sag, and he has a Uranus in Sag. So he's a stellium of planets in Sagittarius. And I want to talk about the fact that he has his North Node in Aries at 29 degrees, the anaretic degree. So he was going through his nodal return during the filming of Sinners, and so is Michael B. Jordan because he's only a year younger than Ryan. And his North Node by whole sign is in the sixth house, which is the house of service. So Ryan wanting to help people as his work is that North Node in the sixth house. The ruler of his sixth house, which is Mars, is also the ruler of his ascendant, this Mars in Capricorn. So he is, like I mentioned, a Scorpio rising, very closely conjunct to Pluto in Scorpio. So he's going through his Pluto square. And his Mars in Capricorn is so interesting to me because it manifests in so many ways. So he has a day chart because his sun is above the horizon line. So technically Mars is his malefic of sect. What that means is Mars is the one that's going to give him trouble. But ultimately, because it's exalted in the sign of Capricorn, it's also going to be his biggest gift. So how this shows up is he So Mars is the planet of, yes, it's the planet of war, it's the planet of conflict. It is the planet, though, of your desire and what you're motivated by. So because Mars is exalted in Saturn, because Mars wants to go fast, but being in a Saturn ruled sign, it's saying, let's do the work. Let's have structure. Let's be disciplined. Let's put in the time and due diligence necessary to get this done. And the third house is writing, communication. It is your neighborhood, siblings, which I think that shows up to his dedication to his brotherhood of Chadwick Boseman and Michael B. Jordan. Yes, they're not technically his blood brothers, but he talks about them a lot as they're his brothers. So Mars exalted in Capricorn is this very dedicated, very responsible, very disciplined person. And he talks a lot about how when he first started making films with Fruitville Station in 2011, I believe, when he just graduated film school, to then working 10 years in the Marvel universe and doing big movies like Black Panther and Creed. Those weren't, like, Black Panther and Creed weren't his films, they weren't his ideas, but he put a lot of work, a lot of dedication and research into those movies. But this, Sinners, was completely his creation. It was the script he wrote, they were his ideas, and the research he needed to do to really make this movie honor the people involved, like the Choctaw Indians, the Chinese immigrants, his own ancestral ties to Mississippi, because he says that his uncle and I think some of his family comes from Mississippi, the Mississippi Delta. So he wanted to do that justice. So that Mars in Capricorn is going to put in the work. It's going to look at things in a long-term vision. Like, I'm going to put in the work to do Black Panther and Creed. And then when it's time, I'm going to do the film in the way that I want to do it. But he needed to put in the work in the beginning, doing films that literally grossed $1 billion. In 2018, Black Panther was the highest grossing film of that year. And that kind of put him on the map as a director. So putting in the work ultimately allowed him to get this landmark deal. Now, what I find also interesting about his chart is his natal Saturn-Jupiter square. So Saturn here is at 6 degrees of Sag, and his Jupiter is, I mean, it's a separating square, but it's still a square. His Jupiter in Pisces is at 19 degrees. And when people have that square in the chart, it speaks about people who have this duality, right? Because Jupiter wants to expand. It's a yes planet. And Saturn's like, we need to be careful. We need to make sure that this is the right thing. And that Saturn is speaking to that Jupiter in its own sign. It's in its own domicile. So I do think ultimately Jupiter does have more dignity than the Saturn, and it's a separating square. But people who have that, and also Michael B. Jordan has that as well. People who have that have an incredible work ethic. Like, they will put in the time because they know that the benefit of the rewards that come later on are going to be worth it. And it's interesting because when they filmed this movie in 2024, they filmed it last year. They started April, and they give the exact dates too. April 13th of 2024 to July 17th, 2024. Part of that time they were filming, we were experiencing a Saturn and Jupiter square in the sky. So it was mirrored from his natal chart to the transits. And if you remember, specifically December too, when we had the Saturn Jupiter square, I think for the last time, We had that mutable mess in December of 2024. Like, just remember how frustrating it is to try to launch something or try to do something. You're trying to grow something. And then constantly Saturn is there saying, no, blocking you, saying, no, are you sure? So you have to have incredible work ethic and grit to keep going, even among the obstacles, right? Because a Saturn square happens every 7 years. So I'm going through my Saturn square right now where I quit my job in 2017. I started this new career move in 2018. And so now 2015 is my Saturn square because at that time it was Saturn in Sagittarius. So right now is the actual Saturn square because Saturn's in the sign of Pisces. And let me tell you, like, I felt like everything that felt like it was growing, something pulled back and said no. But Saturn squares are important because they do test your dedication and it asks you, do you really want this thing? So I know I'm jumping around a lot with Ryan Coogler's chart, but I just want to explain some of his natal chart and how it expresses and manifests in his film making. So going back to the Mars and Capricorn, this also is why it also explains his stutter and his speech because the third house is how you speak. Um, in Vedic astrology, it's the second house, but in Western astrology, it's the third house. And again, Mars is a malefic. And so Mars in a day chart is the malefic of sex. So him stuttering is that Mars. But since it's exalted, it's like his dedication to keep going. He's not going to code switch either because he has a very thick Oakland accent. And people ask him about it too. And I really like that about him. I really like that it's a Saturnian sign. It's a nod back to his community, third house. It's a respect for his roots and where he came from, as Saturn also rules his fourth house of Aquarius. And the fourth house for him is very significant, as we'll talk about the transits when Black Panther was released in 2018. Also, he has an out of bounds moon in his second house of his own personal resources and his income. So, an out of bounds planet. Wait, let me make sure he has an out of bounds. Yes, it's at 24. Okay, so we are looking at this chart based on a very like 1D, it's very flat. But in actuality, the sky is 3D. So you have planets that are at different longitudes and latitudes. So declination is planets at different latitudes. I always get this mixed up. So when a moon is out of bounds, because we observe the planets based on a geocentric way, we are on Earth and we are revolving around the sun and the moon is revolving around us. So when a moon is out of bounds, it's out of the visual sight of the path of the sun. And out of bounds moon people usually don't follow a traditional path in some way. And so the moon ruling his ninth house, the ninth house in astrology is spirituality, is philosophy. Yes, it is foreign lands and foreign travel. But how I'm interpreting this is just the way in which he decides to present something, because the ninth, 10th, and 11th are the highest points of his chart. So his out of bounds moon also being the moon, which is about home and safety and the mother, and about his roots, his cultural roots. And he talks about how when he filmed, or when he was about to film Black Panther, he went to Africa to do more research. So that brought him back to his ancestral lands, the moon, the out of bounds moon in Sagittarius, the traveling part of it. And he, in this movie, The Sinners, which is interesting too, because when he got the idea for it, there were eclipses in Sagittarius and Gemini because this was like 2021. Maybe I'll share the transits then of that time. Okay, so Cotton Field visit. Again, the Cotton Field visit is when he was sharing on the Breakfast Club and he was explaining how he got the idea for this movie. So you can see here that Saturn was in the sign of Aquarius, very closely conjunct his IC, and Jupiter was also transiting his fourth house. So the fourth house is ancestry and home and your foundation, right? It's the foundation of your chart. And Saturn is in its domicile in Aquarius. So, and again, there were eclipses happening in his second and eighth houses. They were hitting his personal planets. It was also Scorpio season. So he's a Scorpio rising. So it was obviously the season where he's thinking about his place in the greater context of his ancestors and ancestral history. And he talks about how when he went on that cotton field, I recommend watching this interview. This was a nod to his most recent ancestors, and which wasn't that long ago. 1932 is just like one generation. It's our grandparents' generation. And so that transit of Saturn and Jupiter in his ancestral sector, the fourth house, is really a nod to the responsibility of storytelling for your ancestors who couldn't tell their stories. And it's interesting because when I look at the chart of when Black Panther was released, there's very similar themes as well. Let me pull that up. Black Panther release was on February 16th, 2018. This was the day after a solar eclipse in the sign of Aquarius. So this was released the day after a solar eclipse in Aquarius, which was in his fourth house of ancestors and home and family and roots. And this was the day of a Mercury Sun Cazimi. And a Mercury Sun Cazimi, again, is like the rebirth of Mercury. It is in the heart of the sun. That's what Cazimi means. And he was in a Mercury, his Mercury was his time lord. So this is based on annual perfections because he was 31. So he was an eighth house year, right? That's like what we inherit from our ancestors. Gemini is his eighth house. The ruler of Gemini is Mercury, and Mercury is in a conjunction with the sun in a Cazimi in his fourth house. So I like using perfections and time lords to see like what is being released, what is being launched. And I'm pretty sure, well, I don't know for sure, but an astrologer could not have made this better of an election. I think he's a very intuitive person. And I think he is in touch with his intuitive instincts. So I don't know. I don't know if he had the power to say Black Panther should be released on this day, but the fact that it's also in the sign of Aquarius, which is like, we are going to build a new story for our ancestors. We're going to look to the future. And Black Panther is very much that kind of movie. It's like, we're going to be the superhero in our own story. This is why I was like, oh my gosh, this is so like the astrology of this moment could not have been more aligned. And that was released 7 years ago, which I mentioned 7 years is a Saturn Jupiter square. So 7 years later, since the release of Black Panther, he is able to now make his own films with a studio backing. I wanted to show again the cotton field visit chart because the way in which he was able to download all of this information and then decide to make this a film, he talks about this on the Breakfast Club interview. And I think it's indicative of the transit Neptune in Pisces at 20 degrees, conjunct his natal Jupiter in Pisces at 19 degrees. Now, having your sun, Mercury in Gemini, and your moon in Sagittarius, this is storytelling energy. And Jupiter in Pisces, being his benefic sect, is world building, world making, imagination, but it's also meaning making. And Neptune is the symbol of the film industry. So he was able to connect the dots of, oh, this is something that I want to maybe make a film about. Now, this was Scorpio season. So he talks about how on November 17th, 2021, he drove from LA to the Bay Area. And that's when I think he was talking about he was going through the death of Chadwick Boseman. He was going through the death of Nipsey Hussle and young Dolph and his uncle. And he was grappling with his own mortality. Because also at the time, this was during the pandemic still. This was 2021. So Mars was in Scorpio. Mars, Neptune, Mars, Mercury, and the Sun were all in Scorpio, transiting his first house. And so he was really reflecting on his own mortality and his relationship to death. At the same time, Saturn in Aquarius was conjunct his IC, the lowest point of the chart, the most private point of the chart. And the fourth house is about your ancestors and your roots and your family. So at the same time, he's like also thinking this recent ancestral history of 1932 Jim Crow South also has to do with my own identity, my own beingness as a Black man living in the United States of America. So all of these transits speak to the ability to ground yourself in the context of history, but also being able to say, oh, this is what I want to create next with Jupiter, with his natal Jupiter in the fifth house of creation being activated by that Neptune in Pisces. Now, another thing is that the North Node was at 1 degree of Gemini, conjunct his natal Sun and Mercury, and the South Node was conjunct his natal Moon in Sag. That also speaks to destiny and fate. And the eclipses were happening in the signs of Gemini and Sagittarius. So I do think it's interesting because they're in his financial houses too, that ultimately the creation, this idea of this movie that was seeded back at that time in 2021, now 4 years later, is what's going to make him a massive amount of money. Like that is what's going to make him set for life, because he talks about too in 2015 when he was making Creed, he was in $200,000 of debt because of film school. And so having Sun, Mercury, Chiron, and Gemini in the eighth house speaks about debt. And his Sagittarius placements in the second house speak about his own resources, his own talents and skills, and what he values. And I do think that having those eclipses was a fated, destined ending and beginning around his financial story and what he chooses to create, what he chooses to story, what stories he chooses to tell, and how much of his own worth is going to be tied to that, because Jupiter is the ruler of his second house. So when the ruler of your second house is in a certain house, you can almost like, it's not a prediction, it's just a reading of where you will be able to finance your life, make money, because again, the second house is your own resources. So the fact that the ruler of his second house is Jupiter in its domicile in the fifth house is he will eventually make money, making his own art his own way and storytell in his own way. So I just thought those were interesting nods to the transits at the time. This is why when Stephanie and I do our monthly horoscopes and we call out certain transits, like this is a good transit to download information or go out in nature or watch a film, listen to music. This is a good day to write. This is a good day to release, because that's the potential of transits, where it really brings your natal chart alive. So I think the fact that he has his sun and moon in storytelling luminaries of Gemini and Sagittarius, and his benefica sect is Jupiter in Pisces, which is world building and imagination and meaning making. They came alive during these transits, and he was able to bring them down to earth with, yes, difficult transits, because sometimes these transits are not easy, especially squares and oppositions. But ultimately, if you have the conviction that you can make it happen, he is experiencing the reward of, I would say, a Saturnian transit, because he had Saturn through his fourth house, which is also a house about ancestral veneration and giving back to the people and the communities that he came from, since Saturn also rules his third house of community. So I also want to speak a little bit about how his second and eighth houses come into his film, because the second and eighth houses are the financial houses in astrology. I think it's really interesting that the themes of this movie also touch on energy exchange, money, what you're worth, permission, consent, negotiations. And it's also reflected in the characters of this movie, and also reflected in his real life. As I mentioned, him wanting ownership of his creative movie, his film, after 25 years, and also making money on the film before the studio recuperates, and owning his craft, owning his art. It's also reflected in his movie as well. So it's seen when Stack and Smoke are negotiating with a Chinese couple when they first come back home from Chicago for Catfish and the Sign, and how Grace, she's also negotiating with him. And I forget if it was Stack. Was it both of the twins negotiating with the racist KKK man at the beginning to buy the juke joint? The little girl that Smoke pays to watch his truck, he also tells her that she needs to negotiate for her worth. And also, when they open the juke joint, the man who didn't have enough money to buy a drink, and Annie says that every man deserves to relax and enjoy. And this whole idea around money and money exchange, consent, like who gets to come into the safe space, who's left out, negotiation. And I think this is all really indicative of, again, him having those eclipses at the time of him forming this idea for this movie in his second and eighth houses, and also just having planets there. Like, I think energy exchange, money, negotiation, permission is always at the top of his mind whenever he's doing anything. And I think he even says that now he has the right to ask for these things because he's put in the work. He's made $1 billion for the Marvel Studios. So this is not that far-fetched for him to ask for a $90 million budget for his movie. So if you have planets or stelliums or anything in your second and eighth houses, you can think about these themes that I'm mentioning, because if you do, then this is a huge life lesson for you, or by transit as well. I wanted to look at the charts of Ryan Coogler and Michael B. Jordan, because I think they're really cute together. So Michael B. Jordan also has an AA rating on astro.com, and he was born February 9th, 1987. And so he's an Aquarius sun at 8:14 p.m. in Orange, California. And wait, let's just look at Michael B. Jordan's chart first on its own. Michael B. Jordan. So he is an Aquarius sun. He is a Cancer moon. Very cute in its domicile. And he is a Virgo rising. So he is having eclipses in his first and seventh house because he's a Virgo rising. And his chart ruler is that Mercury in Pisces in the seventh house. So he is already oriented towards partnership, Michael B. Jordan. And so I heard an interview of Ryan Coogler saying that their partnership began 13 years ago. And automatically, when I hear 13 years, I think of a Neptune transit because Neptune transits a sign for every 14 years. And 13 years ago was even before Black Panther, because Black Panther was 2018, right? So Neptune was in Pisces. And so I think, again, with both of them having Jupiter in Pisces and having Neptune in Michael B. Jordan's seventh house of one-on-one partnerships and Ryan Coogler's fifth house of creativity and creation and entertainment, it's almost like they were destined to work together on film or bringing imagination to the forefront of people's minds. I think it's really cute that Michael B. Jordan has a Cancer moon, and it really speaks to all the interviews and all of the BTS, the behind the scenes that I've been watching on TikTok of him just being very caring and very nurturing. His co-stars also talk about how he wants to work as a team. He's very collaborative, which speaks to his Aquarius sun. Aquarius sun people are oriented towards teamwork and being in a group, which I think is really cute. So let's look at their charts together. So we're going to put Ryan Coogler in the inner ring and Michael B. Jordan on the outer ring. There we go. So I think it's really cute, first of all, that they have an exact Venus and Neptune conjunction in Capricorn. like, ah! So Ryan Coogler he also has Eros there. So Eros is what you are attracted to. And everything in this primordial universe begins with our erotic attraction to something, which, if you read Audre Lorde's essay on the use of the erotic, you will understand what I'm saying. Beyond sex and sexuality, this is like what you are attracted to. So Ryan Coogler has his Neptune and Eros conjunct in the sign of Capricorn. And Michael B. Jordan also has a Venus-Neptune conjunction in his chart, which we will have a Venus-Neptune conjunction this week. I am filming this on April 28th. And so he has an exact Venus. His Venus is exactly conjunct Ryan Coogler's Neptune. That is like, let's make films together. Let's build worlds together. Let's do something for the long term together. Capricorn. So, like I mentioned, Michael B. Jordan also was going through his nodal return because his North Node's in Aries. Also have very similar placements since they were only born like a year apart. But I think that just their placements together speak of two people who just really like work well together. Their part of fortunes are in the same sign, in the same place. So it's like their partnership is going to be abundant for them, not only in terms of money, but in terms of fulfillment of what they're doing. Ryan Coogler has his Venus in Cancer, and Michael B. Jordan has his moon in Cancer, and Venus is the ruler of Ryan Coogler's seventh house of one-on-one partnership. I think that's really cute. So yeah, their synastry is very, very beautiful, very on point. It speaks about two people who are loyal to each other. If you ever find somebody with Scorpio and Capricorn placements like Ryan Coogler, he is loyal, which also speaks to why he's chosen to work with Michael B. Jordan for over 13 years together. You meet those placements, and I feel like they're set for life. It'd be interesting to see as Ryan Coogler makes more movies if he is going to find another leading man. But I don't know. That Venus Neptune conjunction in Capricorn might suggest otherwise. So, the last part of this, I just want to showcase how all of these themes are embodied in the characters of the movie. So, I mentioned in the beginning that Remick, as played by Jack O'Connell, is an Irish vampire, and he specifically chose Irish immigrants to portray vampirism as an allegory to assimilation into this country. So I think it's interesting when we first meet Remick, he is falling from the sky, which is very evocative of Lucifer. Now, Lucifer is in Latin means bringer of light, which is essentially Venus. And I think it's interesting that this film came out after Venus moved from an evening star to a to a morning star, which is Lucifer. And I just went to Mexico in March for my birthday, and I went to Chichen Itza, where there's a temple for the morning star Venus, and there's a temple for the evening star Venus. And our guide was talking about Mayan cosmology and how Lucifer was taken by the Catholic Church to mean the devil, but in actual Mayan cosmology, it's Lucifer is not a devil. It just means the bringer of light, which was Venus. And Venus and the sun had a symbiotic relationship with each other because they had an 8-year cycle. So I do think it's interesting that Ryan Coogler decided to have him falling from the sky as like a fallen angel. Now, because whiteness is a concept that strips people of their connection to their ancestral roots, you see throughout the movie how Remick constantly wants to be invited in so that he can absorb the music talents of Sammy. Sammy is played by Miles Canton, who is a music prodigy in real life, and also Annie, who's played by Wunmi Mosaku, which sounds almost Japanese. I'm sorry if I'm butchering her name, who is a root worker. So she is a hoodoo healer, and she is still connected to her ancestral practices. And ultimately, in the movie, her root work is the thing that saved her and her community until the very end. And the mojo she made for Smoke was what saved him from the vampires. So it's also saying that like our ancestral practices are the only things that can actually protect us. And the church, like Catholicism and Christianity is the same spiritual practices that our oppressors also use. We pray to the same gods that the oppressors pray to. And that was at the end when Sammy was trying to run away from Remick, and he starts reciting the Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Like, how many times do we recite that in the Christian church, right? And then the vampires start reciting the same thing. And I was like, oh shit, I grew up in the Christian church. So I felt like that was very telling of how you are praying to the same gods that the oppressors speak to, because Catholicism and Christianity was used as a tool for colonization. And it's also interesting how Remick, being a white-bodied man, right, because he's an Irish immigrant, also speaks to how the oppressed then become the oppressor, because Irish immigrants in this country were not considered white. And the more he had to align to whiteness to be accepted in this country and assimilate, the further away he was connected to his ancestral roots. And I forget who says this. Was it Delta Slim, who's played by Delroy Lindo, says music is the only thing the oppressor doesn't like push on you or impress on you, like religion and capitalism. So I just thought that was a very interesting way to use these characters and their embodiment to express the allegory of assimilation into this country. Now, the Choctaw Indians, we need a prequel about them because in the beginning, they go to the white couple's house and they warn them about Remick, who's literally, his skin is burning. I'm like, why do you invite that man in? Anyway, they basically say good luck and they leave. And I think this is the best part of the movie because this is 1932. The Indian Removal Act was in 1830. So this had already been 100 years of the genocide of indigenous people. So by now they're like, peace out. Like, you don't want to listen to us. You don't want to heed our warning of the vampires. We're good. And so I thought that was so interesting. I would like to see a prequel of the Choctaw Indians. And then the last thing I'll say is Grace and Bo, the Chinese immigrants who there's this amazing video about Chinese immigrants in the Mississippi Delta and how they were the middlemen because they were allowed to have stores in Black neighborhoods and they sold goods to the Black community and simultaneously the white community. So they were able to shapeshift and be the liminal space for both. And it's interesting because there's a lot of chatter and there's a lot of debate on TikTok and online about Grace ultimately inviting the vampires in. I'm not even going to get to Mary, played by Haley Steinfeld, because she used her proximity to whiteness to then go outside and suss out the vampires. But ultimately, Grace was the one that invited the vampires in, kind of signifying this divide within the Black and Asian community. Whereas historically, we've had solidarity, but throughout history, like the LA riots and the model minority myth, there has been fissures throughout our community because of Asian Americans immigrating here and then assimilating to whiteness and being included in Black spaces. But because of also being in white spaces, there is that divide always. And so I think that was an interesting angle to take with assimilation as well. And yeah, Haley Steinfeld playing Mary, whose grandfather was half Black, and it just again showed a different perspective of assimilation and how she wanted to be included in the Black community very badly. Like, she did not resonate with the Black, her white husband and her white community, but ultimately she was able to use her white bodied, white passingness to suss out the vampires. And then she was the first one to be bitten and then invited back into the space, which is when hell literally started to break loose. So I absolutely loved this movie. I can go on and on and on about the symbolism, about the astrology, about the deeper meanings. But ultimately, what I loved about this movie was that it was art that really spoke to our times in this moment within the context of our history, right? How the United States was founded, how all of our histories are interwoven and interconnected, and ultimately our liberation is also interconnected, but also using it as a way where Ryan Coogler left a lot undefined so that we can have this discourse that, like, outside of film, outside in our own communities, and be a talking piece for how and reflect on how we uphold white supremacy and capitalism in our own way. And I think that is the ultimate power of it. And I don't know, there was some glamour magic, like, you know how vampires use glamour magic to entice its prey. There must have been some glamour magic done on this film because I cannot stop thinking about it 2 weeks after I've seen this film. And I still see people talking about this film. So there's some magic around this film. I think it's protected by the ancestors. I think it's protected by Ryan Coogler's family and ancestors. And I absolutely love that and hope that this inspires other filmmakers, other storytellers to make art, make fantasy, build worlds, and just get started, I guess, is the best, because that's Coogler's advice to people, is to just start now so that you can build your portfolio, and at one point, right after a Saturn square, you will reap the rewards of your hard work. So thank you so much for watching and listening. I had a really good time doing this episode with you all. The best way you can support me is to subscribe, share, and review. And I'll see you next time. Bye.